Okay, we're about ready to start. A couple more people are coming in. So this week's Parsha is Parshas Chukas. Parshas Chukas is the Parsha where transition happens between the times of 38 and a half years in the desert. Parshas Chukas begins with the laws of the red Afer. We are learning about how to purify ourselves from spiritual contamination, being in contact with the dead. And tumas mes, how to deal with spiritual contamination of being in contact with the dead. We are moving over to learn about the passing of Miriam. From last week to this week, there was 38 and a half years passed. I know you didn't notice that, you maybe were asleep, but we have just passed close to 40 years. So we're waking up in this week's Parsha, and suddenly it's 40 years later. So what happens 40 years later is from now, this week's Parsha, next week's Parsha, all the way till the end of the Torah, we are actually going to study about the last year of the Jewish people in the desert. Moshe passes away this week's Miriam passes away this week's Parsha. After Miriam's passing, we learn about Aaron's passing. And then there is the final battles of the Jewish people on the entrance to the land of Israel. The battle with Sichon and Og. Those are the final battles. And basically the next couple of weeks, we are going to learn how the dividing of the land. I mean, we have the incident with Bilam. We have the incident with the girls of Midian. And actually the final war of Moshe is the war against the Midianites. And with this, we kind of concluding the story of the Jewish people in the desert. That's kind of like the end of that. So it's interesting, and some of you have heard that teaching before, but it's important just to get into today's teaching, is the idea how suddenly we are learning about the laws of purifying ourselves from being in contact with the dead. The very basic questions that a lot of commentaries are asking and they're grappling with explaining is, how does that subject come in here? I mean, we have a whole book called the Book of Leviticus. And in the Book of Leviticus, we talk about spiritual contamination. We talk about spiritual purity. We talk about temple service. And we go very extensively learning about all those laws in the Book of Leviticus. And somehow these laws of being in contact with the dead is kind of like out of context. We are reading about the stories of the Jewish people entering the land, and suddenly we have a whole set of laws about how to purify ourselves from being in contact with the dead. And there's many interpretations that are being given. But the one interpretation that landed really well with me was the interpretation that I shared in previous classes, that this is in the last 38 and a half years. What were the Jewish people doing for 38 and a half years? We have no records. We have a record about the first year and a half in the desert, and we have records about the last year and a half in the desert. What happened in the whole block of time in between? Torah tells us that after the sin of the spies, in the book of Deuteronomy, the Torah tells us that the Jewish people were circling the mountain. The idea of circling the mountain means, like you say in English, you say they were walking in circles. Someone is walking in circles, it means there's no purpose. Each one of the travels in the first year and a half carried tremendous purpose. The last part of their journey in the desert also carries tremendous purpose of getting into the land. What happens in the middle? What happens in the middle is there is really no purpose. The only purpose is God says that everybody who's in the desert is going to die. So the only purpose of spending all these years in the desert is to wait for everybody to just die. So anybody who's in the desert, anybody who came in, out of Egypt over the age of 20, is supposed to die in this period of time of this 40 years. So what they are busy with the entire 38 years, every day, is burying their dead. They are busy being in contact with the dead. They're busy being in contact with loss of life. So in order to transition from the loss of life into a life where you have to choose living, is the life of entering the land of Israel. In order to transition to that, you have to go through this purification with a red afer. And this is what we're going to talk about today, about how do we transition from a deep state of mourning and brokenness and enter a new era in our life. Each and every one of us will experience in their life, if you like it or not, a loss. Some of us experiencing right now a loss in our lives, a loss of a loved one, or watching a loved one kind of in his last months or days or years of their life. But really, the sense of death and loss goes back all the way, not just when someone passes away or someone dies. The sense of loss is very much within the human condition. From the moment of conception, we are experiencing loss. There is that moment when we abandon heaven and we enter into human form. Jewish mysticism pays great deal of attention for that tremendous loss that happens when we go from spirit into body. The soul is pure, the soul is holy, the soul experiences tremendous tranquility and peace, and suddenly it's being torn from that space where it was for eternity, and it loses that sense and it enters into physical form. So when the soul is being ushered into a body, that moment of incarnation is a tremendous moment of loss, that the soul actually mourns. The soul actually mourns the loss of what happened in that experience. Then there is the loss of mother's womb. The 9 months in mother's womb can be very blissful for the child. He enjoys the protection, the care, especially if it was a womb that carried a lot of love in it and connection and bonding. And suddenly the soul has to launch out of that body. Comes the moment of birth, and the separation happens between mother and child. There's a tremendous loss at that time where, with great miracles, the human being survives the experience of birth and ushers himself into a new world. And there is that period of time of mourning. There is in Jewish tradition, there is actually something that we do. I don't know if you ever heard about Shalom Zachar. You ever heard about the tradition of a Shalom Zachar, that when a boy is born, the Shabbos after the baby is born, friends come together, and we actually eat food of mourners. We eat round food because the baby mourns. The baby mourns because when the baby is in his mother's belly, he enjoys tremendous bliss. The Talmud describes it, that the baby sits there and studies Torah, whatever form it means. There's an angel that teaches the baby Torah in his mother's womb. Then comes the moment of transitioning, leaving that beautiful spiritual and protected place, and abandoning it for the sake of being separated from mother, being in the world, suddenly breeding on his own, worrying on its safety, worrying about its protection. So again, there's this great loss that happens, not just in conception, there's a great loss that happens at birth as well. Now, if we attend to that, we could actually comfort our babies. When you see the babies crying, we could attend to that. We could talk to the baby. We could promise the baby that it's going to be okay. Everything will be taken care of. And then when a baby hears that and he feels that and they take it into their senses, their food and nourishment and whatever his needs, then they feel consulted, they feel comforted, they feel elevated. And then there is throughout life, every stage of life, there is loss. The loss of the childhood, very traumatic period in a person's time is puberty, where we have to walk away from being a kid to suddenly being independent. And we mourn that time. Time of puberty is a great time of mourning. I don't know if some parents weren't aware of that. But when you see our children as teenagers having a lot of grief going on, they're part of the excitement, or, you could always say it's the hormones, it's this, you could try to conceptualize around that. But one of the things as parents we have to attend to is that grief that a child is experiencing is a result of suddenly moving from being child to being an independent adult. Again, he has to believe that all his needs will be met. He has to believe that everything will be okay. If there was early incidents where those things weren't met and things weren't okay, they step into that part of life with great uncertainty and great anxiety, really worrying about how things will turn around for them. So in every period of a person's life, there is that element of loss that goes through the mourning process. There's a mourning process that we have to go through, unfortunately. You can't bypass that. People who tried bypassing the mourning process could tell you about how endless it was. How endless it was. So the Jewish people left Egypt. They got into the desert, blissful year and a half, heaven and earth, experienced the greatest bliss that a human being could experience, God Almighty himself being in their midst. All their needs are met, manna, protection of clouds, everything was there, like a baby and a child, like a child in his mother's womb. But what happens now after the story of the spies, there is a tremendous period of 38 years almost, close to 38 years, of the only thing you experience is loss. Loss. And now this week's Parsha begins with healing. How do we heal from loss? How do we purify ourselves? How do we cleanse ourselves from being in contact with the loss of life? This is Parsha's Chukas. This is the Parsha of this week, where the Talmud tells us that Moshe, when he heard from God about this impurity called impurity of the dead, and then God started telling him how you purify yourself from that, the Talmud says that Moshe was baffled. Moshe was completely bewildered. How is it even possible to purify yourself from such a deep state of impurity? How is it possible? How can a human being transition from being associated with death and dying to moving to a place of choosing life and living fully? How is it possible? And God gives him the recipe. God is actually teaching him the recipe of transition, the recipe of healing from being associated with death. This is this week's Parsha. Very, very profound and deep Parsha. It says that King Solomon, who was the wisest of all, said regarding this idea of the red afer, the para aduma, the whole this week's Parsha. He said, I said to myself, Echkemo. I said to myself, I want to understand it. It's very far from me from understanding. King Solomon, the wisest of all men, was given all understanding. He knew the language of animals and birds, and he knew every form of communication and understanding. He had the wisdom of God. One thing King Solomon says I don't understand is, how do we purify? How do we go to, what exactly is this red afer business? How does that work? So what we are going to come today in today's class, I'm just giving you a heads up. This is a very profound teaching, and I think you guys are ready for that. But this really is going to touch about what we actually are priming you in the last 2 weeks to really understand the job of Moshe. Really understand the position of a Rebbe. What is the job of a Rebbe? Moshe understands, Moshe is being given to understand this. King Solomon doesn't. What exactly is this position that God is putting in midst between us and God? There's a Moshe. And we need Moshe. We spoke last week about the need of a Moshe. In this week's Parsha, it really comes to a very clear and crystal understanding what exactly is happening here. So first of all, let me give you a few words about this red afer mystery. So God Almighty comes to Moshe in this week's Parsha, and he tells him, "Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemer, zois chukas haTorah." This is the law of the Torah. And he starts telling him what needs to be done. You have to take a red cow, a red afer, that was never used for any work, never had anything carried on his back, never had a yoke on his shoulder. It has to be a young red afer, and then there's no black hair. There's nothing in that bull that is not red, completely red, head to toe, not even 1 or 2 black hair in it. Once it's examined, it's being taken to Mount of Olives. Those of you who are in Israel know where Mount of Olives is. It's right across Temple Mount. There's something called Mount of Olives. It's a burial, actually being used for burial for many, many generations. So you take that young red afer to the Mount of Olives, you slaughter it, and then you burn it in its entirety. You collect the blood, you collect the ashes, you bring water from nearby the Shiloh spring, add water that you collected from there, and then you take a piece of wood, hyssop, and when someone is impure, he gets sprayed on from this cocktail of blood, water, ashes. He gets sprayed on the 7 days of being impure. Yeah, from the day you get in contact with the dead, for 7 days you are impure. You can't eat anything holy. You can't come to the temple. You can't participate in any form of temple service. So in those 7 days, on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, you get sprayed with that blood, water, and ashes. And that's how you achieve your purification. Okay? Does any of that make sense to anyone? It doesn't. But that's what the Torah tells us. This is what God says. This is what needs to be done. And this is how we achieve purification. This is how we transition from impurity to a new state of purity. Now, why is that so tough to understand and none of the other laws in the Torah? Like there's a lot of laws in the Torah that don't make any sense. I mean, all the laws of purity and impurity don't make any sense. Leprosy and different forms of bodily emissions and how that purification happens. I mean, this is not the only thing in the Torah that doesn't make sense. Suddenly here, Shlomo can't understand that. And Moshe, God Almighty himself, teaches Moshe the secret here. Why is it so secretive? Why is it so profound? I mean, really the entire Torah is secretive. Even the stuff that we do understand in the Torah, like honoring parents and you shall not murder, they carry great mystery. It's God's teachings. It's God's Torah. Everything that God teaches us is mysterious. I mean, some of it, God gives us the ability to understand. Why suddenly, when it comes to this interesting phenomenon of taking a red afer and burning it. Suddenly here we're like, okay, it doesn't make any sense. So really, God actually explains Moshe the meaning of the red afer. So, and we all know it. It wasn't a secret. Moshe actually was generous enough to share with all of us the meaning of the red afer. And God Almighty tells Moshe that the red afer is a reminder of the golden calf. Okay? So we have a golden calf, sin that was done. The golden calf was the source of all the sins. All sin stemmed from the sin of the golden calf. So at the sin of the golden calf, God Almighty tells Moshe by taking a red bull, that the color red is the color of gold. And we are using that now. We take that young calf and we use that young bull. That calf becomes a source of purification. And basically explains each one of those things. The water that we take, what does it symbolize? And he tells them what the mixture of using that little branch of that wood symbolizes. All of that Moshe taught us. So what exactly was the piece that didn't make any sense to him, that he found himself all baffled by that? And I'll tell you. What was mysterious to Moshe is a very particular law regarding the red afer, and that is that the one who purifies becomes impure. There's something happens. The guy who sprays, who makes the red afer, becomes contaminated as a result of making it. The one who gets sprayed on becomes pure, and the one who sprays becomes impure. That didn't make any sense. If I am the one who purifies, why am I becoming impure? I understand that you are impure because you were involved with things that are not so healthy. But why am I, or I'm purifying you, why am I becoming impure? Why does it have to affect me that way? Am I taking on myself some of your impurity? That didn't make sense. Why does the Kohen who sprays the blood, who makes the red afer, that Kohen becomes tamei, he becomes impure? By purifying someone else, that's what it takes to purify someone else, I become impure? It didn't make any sense. The way it works is, I am totally pure, and this is why I can purify you. Instead of that, it's the opposite. I become impure by you purifying you. That didn't make any sense. So what I want to open up your mind to is a very, very deep teaching, very spiritual. Some of you will easily connect with it. Some of you will have to think about it for a couple more days after that, and it's okay. And the essence of the teaching is that you cannot heal someone else if you don't carry some of that illness within you. You cannot purify someone else unless you're willing to see that impurity within you. And I want to introduce you to a story to kind of like illustrate a little bit what exactly the essence of this teaching is. And really, it's going to open up your mind to a whole new understanding maybe about human interaction. And maybe some of you will start thinking about the relationship with your children, where some places of improvements are necessary, or even a relationship with yourself or with your spouse. There was once two children. One was Shalom Dov Ber, and the other one was an older brother. His name was Zalman Aaron. Shalom Dov Ber later on became the 5th Chabad Rebbe. I'm named after him. I think I mentioned it in a previous class. His older brother, Reb Zalman Aaron, was also a very good person, a very learned person, and he was a businessman. Their father was Reb Shmuel, the fourth Chabad Rebbe, the fourth in the dynasty. There were 7 Chabad Rebbes in the history, and Rebbe number 4 was Reb Shmuel, and Rebbe number 5 was his son, Shalom Dov Ber. So, since they grew up in a house where the father was a Rebbe, and many people always come for consultations, for questions, naturally, the kids were playing a game of Rebbe and Chassid. Rebbe and Chassid. So Zalman Aaron, the older brother, put on a fur hat, a shtreimel, and he put on a white coat, sat down by the table with some candles, opened up a couple big books, pretended that he's the Rebbe. He's the older brother, so he pretended he's the Rebbe. And the younger brother, Shalom Dov Ber, came in, knocking on the door, like he is the chassid who is coming to the Rebbe to talk about his problems. It's a true story. So he walks in and he tells his older brother, Rebbe, I have sinned. And he tells him which sin he had done. He was cracking nuts on Shabbos. Now, cracking nuts on Shabbos is not a sin, by the way. But in the Chabad tradition, the Alter Rebbe speaks about this, that if you crack nuts on Shabbos, you have to be careful. The shells of the nuts is muktzah. You're not allowed to touch that. So therefore, he says a suggestion that any nuts you want to eat on Shabbos, crack them before Shabbos. Because the shells of the nuts, you can't touch it after you crack the nut. So he's telling his older brother that he has done that error of cracking nuts on Shabbos. And he wants the Rebbe should help him in that spiritual downfall that he had. So his brother tells him, okay, you should say some Tehillim, say some chapters of Psalms. You should learn, you should give some charity. Shalom Dov Ber says, you're not a Rebbe. Forget about it. Not playing with you. And he storms out of the room. Outside of the room, the father was there, Reb Shmuel. And he sees Zalman, the older brother, coming out upset. He says, Shalom Dov Ber doesn't want to play with me. He doesn't want to play with me. We had a nice game. We were playing nice. He says, I'm not a Rebbe. So the father called over Shalom Dov Ber. He was a little boy. He was 3 or 4 years old at the time. And he asked him, what happened? He said, I told him about something that I did. And he says, yeah, and he gave me a tikkun. He told me what to do, to say Psalms, to study, to give charity. He said, so what's the problem? Why are you so upset? Why are you telling him he's not a Rebbe? Why are you so... He says, when I spoke to him, he didn't give a krechts. Know what a krechts is? But I told him what I did wrong. He didn't sigh. He didn't go like, oi. He started giving me advice. He's not a Rebbe. A Rebbe, first reaction is to go, oi. Oi. And if he didn't say oi, he's not going to be a Rebbe. Game over. Now, that's a story that is being told in the history of Rebbe and Hasidim, because that story carries in it such profound depth of what is the role of a Rebbe. What is the role of someone who is being put in position where other people come to you to talk about what torments them. If you cannot pause and let it affect you, if you cannot pause and let it affect you that it hurts you so much that the reaction should be first, before we even talk about how to fix it, the reaction should be, oi. how are you going to ever, ever, ever help that person? So the essence of that is, in order to purify someone else, it's almost impossible to purify someone unless you are willing to join that person in his contamination. Unless you're willing to let that person's suffering and mourning and hurt affect you, meaning to say it becomes you, you become impure, you become touched by what happened, you're not really going to be able to help and support and elevate and really rescue or bring that person out of that darkness. The Kohen who sprays the blood becomes tummy. He becomes contaminated. Suddenly he's in need of healing. Because that's how it works. For you to be able to elevate others, you got to go down on your knees. When you want to pick up a child that is crying, you have to lower yourself to the space of that child. If not, you're never going to be able to pick the child up. The child is not tall enough. So what happens to the Kohen has to go through almost like an experience of a loss. And he's going to have to later on find another Kohen who will purify him. Because that's the only way you can purify others. There is a magnificent story. Again, this is another story, but a little bit more profound because I'm going to take it to another level here. And this is a story that happens with the second Chabad Rebbe. The first Rebbe, his name was Shneir Zalman, called the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe had a son that his name was Dov Ber. Dov Ber. It's called the Mittaler Rebbe. And the story goes with Reb Dov Ber. It's actually a very beautiful story. And I think anybody who works with people, any parent, any caretaker, any therapist has to hear that story, because that story really, really touches on the essence of what this is all about. So basically, the story goes is that the Mittaler Rebbe was traveling. He actually lived in Ukraine. Yeah, what today's Ukraine. And he was in a town, this time of the year, it was a summer, and he was in a town called Samargan. That's the name of the town. And the Mittaler Rebbe, in his travels, decided to stay in the town for a week. Now, people heard that the Mittaler Rebbe was very famous all over Ukraine and Russia. He was a very honorable Rebbe and known as a miracle maker, as a healer. So people from all the towns around came, hundreds of people came to get a moment with the Rebbe, to go in for a moment to talk about what hurts them, what plagues them. Hundreds of people were waiting in line, literally, to go in to see him. Suddenly, the Rebbe says to his secretary, he says, "Let's lock the door." And the Rebbe turned really serious. He said, "We're going to lock the door. We're not letting anybody in." Now, people thought maybe the Rebbe's tired, a long trip. For an hour, the door was locked. After a half hour later, the Rebbe's assistant, his name was Zalman, came out of the Rebbe's room, and his eyes were red, puffy, crying. The Chassidim, who were standing outside waiting to see what happened, turned to Reb Zalman and they said, "What's going on? Something is wrong." An hour or two later, Chassidim started hearing from behind the door how the Rebbe is reciting the verses of Psalms, but he's not just reciting it as a person recites a prayer. He's screaming and sobbing and crying in the middle of a day, regular summer day. Obviously, if the Rebbe is crying that much and it's that loud, all the Hasidim realized something is going on. All of them pulled out their psalms and all of them started crying and all of them started praying. Nobody knew what happened. This went on the entire day. When evening came and they heard that the Rebbe is getting ready to daven mincha, the Rebbe was so exhausted from the crying and the prayers, he couldn't even get himself up to do the afternoon prayer of mincha. He had to go lay down and catch his breath. And an hour later, when it came the time to daven mincha, they found out that the Rebbe is taking out his prayer book where he prays between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. He's going to pray like a high holiday mincha. That was completely, not in the right time. What happens? Everybody was baffled. What's going on? The prayer of mincha was extremely intense. And only after the prayer of mincha, hundreds of people were outside praying and crying. They thought maybe some decree, something bad has happened. Suddenly the Rebbe came out to everybody. He got up on the podium and he started teaching a spiritual teaching, a mimer, on the verse that says in the book of Eicha, this is the book that we read on Tisha B'Av, that we say that the walls of Zion should let their tears stream like a spring, like a river. And the Rebbe spoke in that teaching about this, that when we cry and when we let our tears flow through our eyes, we actually wash out whatever needs to be washed out in our soul. Crying is a form of washing out the soul of a person. And he talked about a topic of the ways of the wicked is in the darkness. And while he was teaching me that teaching, he was sobbing a lot. The next day, the Rebbe was so weak, he couldn't even see people. He had to catch his breath. Nobody still knew what happened. There was one chassid who was actually a chassid from the first Rebbe, from Reb Shneur Zalman, who was traveling on that trip. And finally, he went over to the Rebbe and he said to the Rebbe, everybody wants to know what happened. Everybody's very concerned. You are our Rebbe. We want to know what's going on. And here comes the teaching. So the Rebbe tells him as follows. When a person comes into my room and he tells me about something that he did or something that he needs help with, what I do as a Rebbe is the first thing I do is before I even say anything, I check in with myself. Can I connect to that person? Did I do what that person did? A person comes to me and he tells me that he did something really bad. Can I see myself somewhere on a very little or very different way? Can I connect to that person's mishaf? Can I connect to that person's misdeed? Can I go down to his level and understand what he just did? Usually, when people are walking in and talk about their problems, I find a connection. A person speaks about certain sin that he did. A person talks about certain spiritual misconduct. I could find myself doing similar things on a different level, different realm, not even compared to that, but I could connect. I could actually feel a connection to the sinner because I found a piece of that in myself. Says the Rebbe, a Jew walked in. There was a line of people. And someone walked in and he shared with me something that he did. And it was so horrific. It so was something I never heard before, that someone can do something that bad. And I closed my eyes and I tried to find in myself, where is that in me? How did I, Rebbe, how did I connect to a person who fell so low? It was so low. It was so broken. It was so nonsensical behavior. I just couldn't relate to it. So I started thinking, could be that this is something that sits in the shadows. Maybe it's something that is so deep in my soul. Maybe it's something that, being so occupied with spirituality and with holiness, maybe there's a certain part of my soul that I am not really attending to. Because if that story came to me and I see that evil in someone else, I have to find it in myself. And when I didn't find it, it was extremely painful to me. I closed down the door and I began to pray. And I prayed like I have never prayed before. And after this lengthy prayer, eventually it came to me. Where exactly is my connection to that person? Where exactly did I do something that is somehow connected to that person's terrible mishap? And I felt I could continue being a Rebbe. I could continue being a leader of the Jewish people. Now, this story and the story from before that illustrates this extremely profound idea that in order to be a spiritual leader of other people, you must find a piece of the person that's in front of you, in you. You must. And it's not just about sympathy. Sometimes you could think about sympathy, to be sympathetic. So you basically connect to the person's suffering because you're a person full of sympathy. It's not just about empathy, so you could really be empathetic because you know what the other person is going through because you went through it yourself. It's about literally seeing that the human being that is in front of you is actually mirroring you. That person who comes to you and he struggles is not someone else. There's actually a reason why he showed up to you to talk to you about his problems. Is because you are carrying a piece of that person inside your heart. And this is why he comes to you for help. And by the way, it's one of those teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov says that every Jew, it's really every human, but he talks about every Jew. Every Jew is a mirror. What you see in someone else is actually a projection and a reflection of what you know about yourself. So if you see in someone some really special talents, really special gifts, something really good about someone, and you could say, I see in you love. I could see in you resilience. I could see in you commitment. Whatever you see in another person, take a moment and think about what does that say about you? Because the only thing you could see in someone else is what you have in yourself. If you wouldn't be a person of love, you wouldn't see love in someone else. It's almost 100% that way. If you don't see holiness in yourself, you're not going to see holiness in other people. If you don't see truth in yourself, you have a very hard time seeing truth in other people. When you don't find love towards yourself, it's very hard to love someone else and find love in other people. And the very same thing is regarding the negative. If you cannot find in yourself something that is a micro, tiny chip of where am I connected to that person that is talking to me, that he struggles, you're not going to help that person. There is something within the leader's life, as holy and purified and spiritually is, where he has to find in him that form of a connection with his people, that he can not just relate to what they are doing, but being relatable. It's about knowing that what the other person is going through is my story. That's my story. I just get a chance to work through my story with the assistance of the person sitting in front of me. Now, if I can't find it in myself, I got to dig deep. I got to dig deep. So I remember once at the last day of training of when I was training for therapist. So one of the ends of those weekends that we used to have, long weekends of training, one of the teachers shared that. He shared that from his world as being a therapist. And I was like, wow, yes, I have the stories for that. I know exactly where it is in the Torah, what you just said. Parsha's Chukas. And I was almost jumping out of my seat. And then someone asked a question. He said, what happens if you're sitting with a person who has abused little children? One of the audience asked, he says, so what happens if you're sitting in front of a person who has just shared with you that he's abusing little children, has done something that bad? How do you find it in yourself? And he was very, very, the teacher was very, he was open, he was just teaching in a very beautiful way. And he said, taking advantage on people that are less fortunate than you, taking advantage on people who don't have what you have. How is that abusing little children? Controlling, affecting people who are less strong and less talented and less gifted because you are the superior. You got to find it in yourself. Not exactly the same way, but there has to be a universe where you can relate and basically go through your own process. Yes, becoming self-contaminated by the materials that are presented to you, so you can actually heal yourself, and via your own healing, that person who is in front of you receives his healing as well. The Rebbe was not talking at the Chassid. The Rebbe who is talking at the Chassid is not a Rebbe. This is where Shalom Dov Ber runs out of the room and he says, you're not a Rebbe, I don't want to play with you. You're talking at me. The Rebbe is talking from his own pain. There is that krechts. There is that oi. What is the oi? The oi is not a judgment on the person in front of you. The oi means it hurts me. I know what you're talking about. I just found that in me. Oi! And once he had that oi, whatever he's going to say after that, he's talking to himself. And the other person is just listening in. And he receives his healing. So going back to this week's Parsha, Moshe Rabbeinu comes to Hashem and he says, Hashem, I understand everything. I understand the mystery. Why does that person have to become contaminated if he purifies? That I don't understand. And Hashem tells him this is something that only Moshe can understand. Only someone who is in the position of Moshe, only he can understand this phenomenon, that you become contaminated by healing others. And it's part of that process that is necessary. And then Hashem tells him, there's going to be another 9 red afers done in future history. Yeah? The first one Moshe did. 8 were done during the Second Temple era. They made 8 red afers. And the 10th one will be done with Mashiach. And each one of those red afers will have a mixture of the ashes that you have created while we were in the desert. They had to save some of those ashes, and they had to mix from those ashes in each one of the future red ephers, all the way till the coming of Mashiach. Because that's the only way we can purify ourselves. The only way we can move forward in life from being in a situation where we are being surrounded with darkness, with death, with the opposite of life, is by connecting to the Moshe energy that exists not only in that generation when the Jewish people were in the desert, but those ashes of Moshe continue going from generation to generation. The Zohar says, "Ispashtusa de Moshe b'chol dora v'dora." Moshe continues influencing every generation and every generation that comes after that. The entire Moshe. It's a different body carrying this Moshe. But Moshe itself, who contaminated himself, yes, Elazar was the one who slaughtered the cow. But Moshe himself created. Yeah, it's called the red afer of Moshe. Moshe himself contaminated himself to purify someone else. So right now in our day and age, when you find yourself someone afraid or lost, you have to remember that the ashes of Moshe are still existing in our generation. Especially now that we're about to enter the 3 weeks and the 9 days and Tisha B'Av, the time of destruction and mourning. I need us to know that he's never alone. You're never alone. There is always, even though you don't see maybe the ashes that Moshe created, but they are there. They are going to be there all the way till Mashiach comes. In every generation, they're going to be there. And they are there for you, to serve you, to be able to purify yourself and elevate yourself, to ascend from those places of darkness, from those places of loss experience, to be able to choose life. Now that teaching really touches on what is the essence of what Moshe Rabbeinu is all about. What is Moshe all about? Call him Moshe. The name Moshe means the deliverer. He was delivered from the water. Yeah, he was pulled out of the water. Because what is Moshe's job? What is his job? Why did God put Moshe in the world? Why do we have in every generation a Moshe? The job of Moshe Rabbeinu is for one reason and one reason only: to elevate us in the dark moments of our lives. That's why we have a Moshe Rabbeinu. The world that we live in is very confusing sometimes. The life that we live is very confusing sometimes. The loneliness, the feeling of no one understands me. No one knows what I'm going through. No one really krechzes with me, because no one really knows what's going on with me. That's a lie, by the way. That's a big lie. Because you have to remember, in every generation, there are people who carry those ashes of Moshe with them. And not only they are listening, not only they know, they are krechzing with you. And when you know that someone else is with you at that same state of mind that you are, that already lifts you up. It's already become the source of elevation. So the teaching here for each and every one of us, we are standing in a time of the year where we are connecting in these parshas that we learned in the last 3 weeks: the loss of leadership, the claiming of leadership, the connection to Moshe's teaching. It's always in that time of the year, like we did last week. It was the anniversary of the passing of the Rebbe. It's a time for us to connect to that lesson, to that message. We have to find each other. We have to find each other, and we have to start seeing in each other the pieces that another person carries that is the same thing as yours. We are not meant to do this alone, okay? I don't know whoever told you, who convinced you that life is meant to be done alone. It wasn't. It was never true. It's not true right now, and it's never going to be true. Life was meant to be done together. Okay? So if you somehow, in a certain point in your life, realize that you have to do this all on your own, I want to remind you there was a lie. It was always a lie. And it will always be a lie. We are supposed to do life together, especially Jewish people in this world. We are meant to do life together. We are meant to do this together. We cannot be on our own. Even though you have a good plumber on your speed dial, and you have a good rabbi on your speed dial, and you have a good, support system on your speed dial, you're not meant to do this alone. The anguish, the mischief, the frustrations of life, we see it in each other. You can look right now at the people who are sitting right here. We could see this in each other. And it's not your peace, it's shared. Your grief is someone else's grief too. You're not a big meat. In Yiddish, you say a yachsin. You're not such a yachsin, not such a special person that you're the only one. I'm the only person who cornered addiction for today. Nobody in the world knows what I'm going through. That's arrogance, by the way. So many people around the room and around your life struggle, just want someone like you to see them and experience together with them. Yes, it comes on the price of a little bit of contamination. You have to krecht for them. But how elevating is that? How much sobriety, how much clarity of mind comes when you could actually grieve with someone else in an open heart, in an open place. You're not alone anymore. The shame goes through the chimney, the guilt goes through the chimney. All of that evaporates. You feel validated, you feel connected, you feel seen and heard. Now, if Moshe Rabbeinu is doing that, the Rebbe does it, the highest spiritual person is supposed to be that par excellence type of a person who sees that in others. How much more do we, each and every one of us, have to do this to each other? Starting from our own spouse, from our own children, listening, hearing them, seeing them, krechting with them. Don't try to fix. Don't try to fix. Fixing is ego. Krechting is spirit. Obviously, if you can, a couple of dollars always helps. Getting a connection, finding them a job, helping them, always helps. Always helps. But you are ultimately elevating them by looking at them and listening and krechting together with them. This is where intimacy gets created. This is where human connection gets created. This is where elevation happens. The ashes of Moshe are with us. It's not gone. We just have to connect to that Moshe teaching, especially in times like this, when in this week's Parsha, we're going to lose Miriam, we're going to lose Aaron, great guardians and protections for the Jewish people. That's the only way we can survive, is with those ashes of Moshe. And this is what the Rebbe was. The Rebbe was a person who, he didn't have spiritual struggles. He davened the whole day and he learned the whole day. He was a perfect soul. He didn't have to do anything. He was one of those only human beings. Every generation, we have a couple of those who don't have to do anything. He had it all. But what was his life about? What was the life of the Rebbe? The life of the Rebbe was lifting up us, elevating us, raising us, bringing us up to those spiritual heights that we need to. I'm just going to conclude with a little story before I say goodbye to you. And there was a story that with a chassid, there was a guy, his name is Rabbi Darren, he's still alive. He's in Connecticut, in Stanford University. Stanford is Connecticut, yeah. So he was the Chabad rabbi in Stanford University. And Rabbi Darren, one time, wrote a note to the Rebbe, and he slid a note under the Rebbe's door. A minute after he did it, suddenly he realized, like, shoot, the Rebbe is going to have to get up from his place, bend down. The Rebbe is not a young man. Bend down and lift up the note from the floor. How stupid am I? What did I just do? And it started eating him up that he did it, that he caused, by sliding the letter under the door, he caused the Rebbe to have to get up from his seat, pay attention to it, lift up the letter from the floor. He was very, very like distraught about it, very upset. He right away sat down and he wrote an apology letter. Basically saying, it was the heat of the moment. I wasn't thinking. I'm sorry, Rebbe, for causing you to have to pick up something from the floor. I should have put it by your secretary. I was just too impulsive, and kind of like really apologizing, asking the Rebbe for forgiveness for throwing a letter under his door. Within minutes of putting in that note, the Rebbe responded with these words, and I'm going to say it in English. I heard a story from him himself. The Rebbe said, "This is the entire purpose of my being, to lift up what's forgotten, what's abandoned." That's the purpose of Rebbe. The purpose of Moshe is to lift up what people leave behind them, but we forget. So in times like this, we really need this connection. Last Friday, I asked the children in camp. We have a big summer camp going on here. Kenai Nahara, it's close to, I'm not going to even say the number because there's Kenai Nahara is such a big number of children. And I asked the kids on Friday, I said, I want you to take a moment. You're going to get a piece of paper. I told them about who the Rebbe was. And I said, I want you to take a piece of paper and just write something, a request, a blessing, the whole being of myself and Nechama and Issachar and all those counselors. We are here because of the Rebbe. So just take a moment of time and just express gratitude, ask for something. It's the Rebbe's day of fasting. It's a yahrzeit. It's a holy day. So sit down and write something. And at the end of the day, I collected about 50 from all the kids who were here. I had about 50 pieces of paper. Not everybody wrote, but I had about 50 pieces of paper, all folded up, So I took those pieces of paper and I started straightening them out. And I started with one eye, I started reading some of those things that the kids are writing. And I found myself sobbing throughout this time. I'm like going through letter by letter. I'm like, oh my gosh. Those kids, some of them are writing about really painful stuff that they're going through. Social anxiety, problems with their parents, problems that they're noticing in their parents having. Now kids know everything, by the way, everything. Some kids just wrote gratitude, how thankful they are for having this camp, that they feel so much joy and happiness. It was very beautiful. I took all the notes and I was planning to scan it all and send it in to the Rebbe's graveside so someone could take it to the actual grave and put it there. All those prayers from the kids. I actually wrote my own note as well, with my requests, with my aches and my pains. Whatever reason, the scanner didn't work. I thought it scanned it, but it didn't. And then came Shabbos. And then Sunday morning, I'm holding the stash of letters in my hand, and I'm saying to myself, Barry, these letters, you should deliver them yourself. If you feel that you are their connection, you are the ones who are bringing those kids to be inspired by the Rebbe and by his teachings, this is too profound and too special than just going through some form of email or fax or something. Go to New York. It was 9 o'clock in the morning. I made myself a ticket for that night. And I took a red-eye flight. And I arrived to New York at 5 o'clock in the morning together with Mayor Simcha. Simcha was traveling to camp, so I took a flight to New York. And throughout the flight, me and Mayor were studying, and then we were reciting Psalms. We were very excited about going in first thing in the morning. We're going to step into the Rebbe's graveside. I mean, I didn't prepare myself much, and we just stayed throughout the 4 or 5 hours of the flight, just reciting Tehillim and praying and just kind of like being in a spiritual place. And as we landed, we took the cab and we went straight to the Rebbe's graveside. You know, washed our hands, cleaned ourselves up, and went straight into the cemetery. It was just sunrise in New York, and I got into the Rebbe's graveside, and there was a pile of papers. This is the date. This is Monday morning. All the people who came on Friday and Thursday and Sunday. There was a mountain of papers, requests from all over the world, thousands and thousands of papers, like piled up like a mountain. And I stood there with Mayor and we started praying. We spent about 2 hours just praying. It was not a lot of people. It was early in the morning, so it was about 4 or 5 people in the entire space. And I started reading through letter by letter. Now, I don't know who the kids only wrote their name and mother's names. I don't know who they are. But I started reading through those letters, standing at the Rebbe's graveside. I mean, I took the 4 o'clock, I was already flying back to Seattle. It was just a couple hours being there. But it was so precious to take each one of those letters, kids writing it with markers and crayons, and reading each one of those letters and ripping them up, placing them on the Rebbe's graveside, and knowing that the Rebbe, now it's in the Rebbe's hands. Now it's in the Rebbe's hands. It was very special. Just wanted to share with you that. So if you need a little bit of uplifting, do that. Write a note to the Rebbe. Connect to this Moshe that is in our generation, that is not yet replaced with another one. And you'll find great comfort. Great comfort. All right. Guys, have a good Shabbos. It was wonderful spending time with you. Thank you for listening and participating.